and tonight, and it's brilliant. One thing that I'm curious, I grew up as a film student in Europe. We loved Spielberg. We adore him. We thought he was brilliant and a genius. We couldn't figure out why Americans weren't so hot on him. So what was your perception when you started working on the film?
Well, I mean, I think he was always a very popular filmmaker. So when you say Americans, you're talking about critics.
Yeah, American critics, yeah.
I think whenever, I mean, honestly, I think the answer is pretty simplistic. He is a populist in many ways, and he's a very commercially successful filmmaker. And I think that, Dickens had this problem, too. Dickens was serialized in magazines, and he couldn't be taken seriously as a novelist to save his soul, because he was serialized in magazines and made a good living because he had all those children and everything. I think Steven has suffered a little bit from being so successful. There's a little bit, as Tony Scott says, a little suspicion. If you're that successful and you make that much money, how can you be a serious artist? But I also think that he had to go on a journey of maturity, which is one of the things I've tried to show in this film, to achieve the kind of masterful filmmaking, so to speak, that he had always set out to do. But there's always going to be, I mean, he has unbelievable instincts about what an audience is going to want to see. So, I don't know. I think that his sentimentality has been held against him. His need to kind of wrap things up, and that's why I put a lot of attention onto Munich, because I think Munich I actually think is probably his most mature film, where he is tackling a very complex subject and not attempting to wrap it up neatly. He's raising complex questions, and I think he's going to do that more and more in his filmmaking. But I don't know. I don't really know the answer, except that I think it's very hard to be that rich, that successful, and be taken seriously as an artist.
I think one of the very beautiful things of the film, and Bob Balaban has a line, he said, Steven he didn't want to make small personal films, he wants to make big personal films. And the way you prove that his films actually come from deep between his own autobiography and his own, from within the system of belief that is very personal, even if they reach this mass appeal, it's wonderful, because you really find his greatness. Can you explain how you achieved it, how you drew out of him?
Well, that is what I wanted to do. I really, when I set out to make a film about someone, even someone I admire, and I wouldn't actually spend 2.5 years on making a film about somebody I didn't like, but I am a fan of Steven's work, and I felt that he was probably not taken as seriously as he should be as a filmmaker. But I didn't set out to make an apologia. I never do that. In fact, I want to say this, I started every interview by saying I don't want to hear the word genius. I don't want to hear fantastic. I don't want to hear he's amazing. I don't want to hear what a nice guy he is. And you never hear this once in this film. I wanted to show what I saw when I watched his movies over and over and over again, was exactly that there is a very personal filmmaker, that he is making films that come out of a very, very deep place in him, and I wanted to show that. How did I do that? It was very hard. Not that it was so hard to get him there, because when he set out to do this with me, I mean, I didn't start off the first interview saying, talk to me about your difficult relationship with your father. We got there. But what was hard is how to take 29 films, and I did decide to focus on him only as a director, how to keep a compelling storyline going, pay homage to craft, because I think he's a great craftsman, I think he's a great filmmaker, and at the same time develop a set of thematic storylines. Very hard. It took a year in the edit room to do it. But I knew where I was going with it, and I don't think he necessarily did. He was very surprised, by the way, when he saw the film. And the first thing he said to me when he saw the film was, "Really bold of you to start a movie about a director with somebody else's movie." And I thought, oh shit. He went, "I love it, I love it." But that was great. But he also said he felt like he'd been through 12 years of therapy. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
No, you are, and I'm going to dwell more into it. But first, did you agree from the outset that you were going to have like 30-hour interview?
No, that was, I said that in my introduction. I think the most anybody I've ever made a film about, and not everybody I've ever made a film about is alive, so it didn't become an issue, but 4 interviews was pretty much max, you know. So I don't know how it happened that we got so engaged in the first interview, which went for 2 hours, and honestly, he was truly he was a kid when it was like 12 or something when we got to that point, and he was just beginning to understand that he was interested in film. And he said, "Boy, that was fun. When are we doing that again?" And it kind of went that way. The only thing that he asked, and this is interesting, and I learned later why, he said, when we do the interviews, I would love it if we could do them chronologically. Now, I didn't know how I was going to structure the film, but I was willing to go along with that. As we got further into it, I threw a lot of curveballs into that, but I understood it. He's a very busy guy, and he's always directing one movie and editing another and developing 40 new things and running an empire. It was helpful to him the few days before each interview to kind of remember where we were and where we were going, so he could prepare himself mentally for that. Which
also, I think, fits into as a storyteller. It just kept going with a story, right? So it wasn't back and forth.
But I did throw curveballs into it, you know, and towards the end, I kind of had to let it go because I really wanted to explore these thematic things with him. But the other thing I learned about him. Oh, this was phenomenal. Is he's got the best memory of anybody. I mean, he really can remember everything. I would ask him a question in interview 7, and he'd say, "I think we talked about that in the first interview," and I wouldn't even have remembered it. But more importantly, he could talk about every single decision he made in making a film as if he had made the film the day before, and that really impressed me. Really, I was thrown completely by when he described the death of the truck in Duel, a movie he'd made 50 years before, if not more, as if he had made the film yesterday and he remembered every detail. And I didn't prepare him for these things. You know, he was amazing. And he's very, very articulate in talking about his craft. And people always ask me, what is the thing you were most surprised about with Steven? Because I've made films about so many artists of different ilks and have found that many of them are not really very comfortable talking about their work and very articulate about it. And he really is. And I was so impressed with that.
And it's interesting because he talks about his craft almost like he talks about his biography. There is the same analytical precision to it, which is very interesting and very personable. Yeah. So it comes across in the film very, very beautifully. How hard was to decide which films to focus and which one to let out, leave out?
It was so hard. And I had to let a lot of things go. Initially, this was going to be a film over 2 nights, and which HBO had asked for. And I don't really know what happened. It had nothing to do with the filmmaking. They love the filmmaking, but I think they had some experience with having difficulty getting audiences back a second night unless there was some kind of a cliffhanger. And this wasn't a cliffhanger. It wasn't the jinx. There was no murder. Did he do it? Did he not do it? You know. And the first night ended with Schindler's List, and they felt it was so powerful, and it had been such a complete emotional journey that people would think the film was over and not necessarily come back night 2. There were 13 more movies after Schindler's List, and as far as I'm concerned, he became a very different filmmaker. So they said, they were great. Richard Plepler, who's the head of HBO, said, look, I think it would work better in 1 night, but you're the filmmaker. If you feel that this is going to hurt your film, or you don't feel okay about it, or you feel your artistry is in any way compromised, We'll leave the decision with you. And then I watched it with a bunch of filmmakers. And Roger, are you here? Roger Sherman? Okay. Who's a good friend, and he said, I think if you didn't see part one, and you only saw part two, you'd have a difficult time understanding it. Because so many themes and ideas are set up in part one that pay off in part two. And I went, you know, that's true. I don't want to run that risk. So I took an hour out of this film. An hour out. And it was hard. Now, in terms of what did I decide to focus on? You know, there's certain storylines that you have to do. I worried about doing Jaws because if there's one story, people kind of know it's Jaws. So I had hesitancy about it, and I thought, well, I'm not making this film for the people who know Steven Spielberg necessarily, who know his work. They're expecting an audience of 10 million people. And not everybody knows every story about Steven Spielberg, so I want to show very early on that he had such a strong vision and such a strong belief in himself that he had the courage to keep on with a film that he literally thought he was going to get fired from every day, and he thought it was over for him. That the word in all the parties around Los Angeles at the time was he was never going to get another job. But he stuck with it, and I wanted to show that. I thought that was an important part of his story, and if you didn't know everything, you needed to know that.
And I think it's also interesting because it fits into the fact that he still, I wouldn't say improvise when he gets on set, but it's a completely intuitively kind of filmmaking, and it just has it. And that's, you know, you hear his colleagues, you hear Coppola, you hear Scorsese, you know, they're almost envious because he has this one thing that they don't have. And it's
an interesting combination of intuition and working from your gut and being incredibly prepared. Mm-hmm. But the only thing I would say about the choices is that everything that's in the film is there for a reason. It serves the story. So as much as I loved AI and wanted to put that in the film because I think it's a really interesting kind of outlier film, it didn't advance the story. It's kind of an outlier. It was really partly Stanley Kubrick's story, and it's its own film. So that kind of helped narrow things down a bit.
Towards the end of the film, Jim Hoberman, you know, says, well, you know, and he's talking about Munich, and he's recognizing the complexity of, you know, the moral equivalence, and how daring is for Spielberg to establish such moral equivalence. And he says, well, it's kind of become a Hollywood version of a public intellectual. Do you agree?
Yeah, and I particularly wanted Jim Hoberman in the film because he's not a fan of Steven Spielberg. He's a real critic of Steven Spielberg, and when I called him and asked me to do an interview, he said, I'm going to be your token person who doesn't like Steven Spielberg. You're going to make me look really bad. And I said, no, you know, you just have to trust. I won't embarrass you. But I found him very interesting. And yes, I think maybe that might be a bit of a stretch, what he said there, but I was very happy he said it. Because Steven is, let me put it this way, Steven is a very serious person, and he understands the responsibility that comes, I think, with being an elder at this point, and the most successful man in the film business. That carries a certain weight, and I think he understands that weight, and that it is film's responsibility to address the issues of the day. And I think he's a very courageous filmmaker, and I wanted to show that here. But you know, his latest movie is about the publishing of the Pentagon Papers, a story called The Paper, with the story of Ben Bradley and Katharine Graham, which will open in a few days. Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep, directed by Steven. And that was a movie that wasn't even on the radar when I was making this film. But I think he looked around and he said, what the fuck is going on in this country? I got to do something about it. And he decided to tell that story. And he did. So I think to the extent that you could call that being a public intellectual in film, that probably works. He's not, you know, he's never going to be a Buñuel, you know, and It's not that kind of filmmaker. He's a populist
but you
filmmaker.
but you do believe that at this point he feels a responsibility to tell certain stories as opposed to other, because the shift here he does Schindler's List and then he does Jurassic, and that's like wow.
In the same year, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. And then from there he works more and more and more into quote unquote reality and into stories that are related.
I tried to show that, because that's why I say there's before Schindler's List and after Schindler's List. And part of that was becoming a father. And as he said, I wanted to make Lee, I didn't, reality began to trump fantasy. And actually he said to me, we did the interview, he said, reality trump, no, I said again, I don't want to use the word trump. But he saw that he was moving towards it. By the way, I'm a big fan of Empire of the Sun, which I don't think enough do. But
it's a beautiful.
Oh, I love that movie. I think he saw after that he had kids, and he wanted to create build a body of work that wasn't just dinosaurs and fantasy.
If anyone has questions, because I thought I saw it right there.
Did he help him direct this documentary on
He didn't see it till it was finished. You didn't hear me say that? He did not see the film till it was finished.
Because he likes to get his hands in it.
No, I know, that's what everybody thinks that, but he had to actually sign something that said he wouldn't do that, and he couldn't do that, and he had no editorial control over this film. So he...
Did you know your work? I mean, what did you show him before to prove that you were the right person to do this?
He had seen he'd seen my Leonard Bernstein film and had written me a letter about that many, many years ago, 20 years ago. And we had met a few times, and then I did an interview with him for a film I did on David Geffen. And we had a really good time. And because David Geffen was one of the partners in DreamWorks. And then he saw the film, and he really liked it. And he said, she's a really good filmmaker. I called me and said, I know you've been wanting to make a film about me. I think I'm ready. Would you consider making a film about me? And I was like, sure, it's time now. And then we had to go through the process of him signing a contract saying he didn't have any control over the film. It was not a problem, honestly. I've never had such an easy situation, and I know his reputation too. So I was surprised. In 15 interviews, not once, and this took place over a year, did he ever say, can I see something? Not once. A real tribute to him.
Yeah, he's directed some of today's great actors over his career, and there was no mention of the actors in the film. Did he ever bring up actors in particular, like a quote about who's the director that had no respect for actors?
Hitchcock.
Hitchcock, exactly. Hitchcock had no respect.
Okay, let me repeat the question. May I repeat your question for everyone? Yeah, he said that he's worked with so many of the greatest actors of our days, and but for some reason, he doesn't talk about it, and he was wondering, asking Susan if he ever brings actor, or if it was like Hitchcock that has show contempt for his actor.
Well, we did obviously talk about his actors, and he didn't have very much to say, truly. He said, mostly I try to get out of their way. I think one of his geniuses is casting, and I had a whole section on that in the film, which had to come out. But he is a genius caster, and he does get great performances out of actors. Not all actors are equally good at talking about that, by the way, which is why the Schindler's List sequence is so long, because I had 3 actors who really, really could talk about him as a director. At the same time, we're talking about one of the most important films he's ever made, and coming to terms with Judaism and all of those things. So it's quite long, but it was partly because Ben and Liam and Rafe were all so articulate in helping me understand why Steven's a great director of actors. And I got to tell you, it's very hard to get. I interviewed them all, and it was very difficult to get most actors to be able to talk articulately about him as a director and what made him a great director. They all love him. They all are amazed by him. can't get over the fact that he's clearly editing the film while he's shooting it and already sees where it's going. But they can really talk about what makes him a great director in terms of working with him as an actor. Because I think he trusts his actors. And as he said, he mostly just gets out of their way.
Yeah, I'm so curious why this important relationship with Kate, which totally changed the direction of his filmmaking, why she wasn't interviewed.
She didn't want to be.
Yeah, I was sure of that.
No.
But you'll have to make the next documentary when she's ready.
I don't think she's not comfortable in that role. I think they've only worked together once, and so I don't think she felt she could talk about him and his career. We did have a funny conversation because I know she was very supportive of him doing this and of me being the director. So one day when we did the very last pickup interview, he had already seen some sections of the film. The very last one, I needed a few pickups. And I said, have you shown anything to Kate yet? And he said, no. So I'm afraid to. I said, why? I said, I thought she wanted you to do this. And he looked at me and he said, she did. But Susan, she didn't think it was going to be personal. And he was like, and we both kind of went, duh, you know, and we laughed about it. I don't think she realized that it was going to be the kind of film that it was. I think she is used to going to one tribute thing after another, whatever. She called me after she saw the film, which was after it premiered at the New York Film Festival, and was very complimentary about it, but didn't say that she wished she'd been in it.
Right. But, yeah.
I don't think the film's missing a great deal by not having her. What was she going to say? His great husband? I mean, I don't think we would have learned too much.
I guess what I wanted, you know, I would have imagined, they have a terrifically, I was a marriage counselor for 20 years. So I think, you know, in my book, they have a terrifically successful marriage, which is to grow each other to the next place. And they did that, right?
But don't you think you see that in the film?
I see it, but I want to know more. Maybe that's because I'm a therapist, you know. And, you know, I want people to learn how, you know.
Well, they're not going to talk about that.
Right.
Are any of the children involved in the film?
Yes, there's Sawyer. So I think Sawyer's an actor, and he's actually been in plays at Bay Street. The kids were all sitting in front of my family at the New York Film Festival. And I didn't interview any of the kids for a reason. There's 7 of them. And somebody said, if you interview one, you have to interview them all, and then they all have to have equal time. And I said, you know, I just don't want to deal with that in the edit room. And again, I didn't think that they would have tremendous amount to add, which was absolutely borne out that night, because there was a big dinner, not a big, small dinner after the New York Film Festival. And they all came over to me, kind of one by one, and said, I didn't know any of this stuff about my father. We see our father talk. And I was watching them because I was sitting behind them in the screen, and they were nudging each other and laughing and going, did you see? You know, it was one of those, like, totally mind-blowing for them to have this picture of their father that they hadn't seen. And they wrote me, and he wrote me about it, too, afterwards. So they're lovely. They all do different things. They're all in a creative world. And, of course, Jessica is an actress, his adopted first daughter. So they are, in some ways, many of them. I mean, they're not all, but some of them are involved in film.
His second marriage and then Schindler's List seemed to be a turning point back to his religion. What's his relationship to Judaism now?
Well, I think he came back into the fold. I think they've raised all their children. They've all been bar mitzvahed and bas mitzvahs and bas mitzvahed. I think he is an observant Jew. I don't think he's certainly not Orthodox, but he's involved in spirituality means a great deal to him. Whether he goes to a temple I don't know. I really don't know. But I know he's a spiritual person. Oh. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Julia.